The story begins with a brigadier general named Hummel. His wife had recently passed away, and that morning he returned to the cemetery to deliver his revenge plan. Hummel had been preparing this plan for a long time, but he was waiting for his wife to die to start the execution. A few nights later, a group of Marines infiltrated the military base, the main base where the American military kept various deadly weapons. These troops were led by Hummel, and that night they went in there to steal a secret weapon. After the guards were taken down, they managed to steal access to the weapons safe. Inside the safe, seen many missiles, but the ones they want were missiles stored in the level 4 room. One by one, the missiles were then transported out. But in the middle of their action, someone accidentally dropped the missile, and the contents of the missile turned out to be the deadliest chemical weapon. On the other hand, introduced to an FBI agent and biochemist named Dr. Stanley Goodspeed. That afternoon, they were examining a package that was believed to be sent from an unknown terrorist group, so the package was immediately taken to the lab for examination. At first, when they opened it, everything inside was normal, but suddenly the doll emitted gas. Not only did the doll spray poisonous gas, it also contained a C4 bomb. They only had no less than 1 minute to neutralize it. The problem was, the poisonous gas coming out of the doll was also starting to melt their clothes, and if it got on their skin, it would be the end of Stanley's life. Fortunately, Stanley could keep the situation under control. He even looked very calm when defusing the bomb. However, his reaction is reversed when his girlfriend Jay drops by his apartment and informs him that she is pregnant. Return back to Brigadier General Hummel, who is posing as a tourist. That morning, they visit an island that used to be the strictest prison in America called the Rock. In the middle of their visit, Brigadier General Hummel and his men commit sabotage. They immediately took all the tourists on the island as hostage. Not only that, they planned to turn the island into their main base. So finally told what exactly the main plan of Hummel is and why they decided to betray their country. It turns out that during his decades of service, Hummel saw many of his members die in special missions, more precisely illegal missions. Unfortunately, these fighters weren't even considered by the state, and their families weren't got compensation at all. Brigadier General Hummel and his members demanded justice for this incident. That night, Brigadier General Hummel contacted the head of the FBI named Womack and told him that they were holding 81 civilians. Not only that, Brigadier General Hummel also said that they were ready to fire 15 chemical missiles at the San Francisco city if their demands weren't met. For now, Womack was asked to gather state officials first. Long story short, that night all the state officials attended a special meeting. They were shocked when they heard that Brigadier General Hummel had betrayed them. Because not only a military officer, Hummel was also known as a national hero. There were dozens of special-level missions that he successfully completed during his service. Hummel then presented his demands, in which he requested that the government send $100 million to a designated account. 83 of Hummel's men died on missions, and to date all of their families haven't been compensated. Hummel plans to distribute all the money. On the other hand, unlike the terrorist attacks, this time the government was threatened by their own soldiers. That's why they have to be very careful. If the government refuses to comply with the request, then the lives of the hostages and the entire San Francisco will be at stake. Then, the missile that Brigadier General Hummel was going to fire was actually a classified weapon. That's why that night, the presidential chief of staff asked exactly how dangerous the impact of the missile was. It turns out that one X-5 missile can kill no less than 70,000 civilians. The only way to stop the missile's attack is to sabotage the chip inside. But the missile can only be opened by a biochemist, and this is where Dr. Stanley's expertise is needed. The government also plans to send a special forces team to the Rock Island. The problem is that the island has been uninhabited for a long time, and the prison on the island has been renovated several times. Now they needed someone reliable to infiltrate it. Actually, the head of the FBI knows the only prisoner who has ever escaped from the Rock prison. The problem is, this prisoner is top secret, and he is also a very dangerous person. That person is none other than John Patrick Mason. Now they have to find a way to get Mason to open up and tell them how he escaped from the Rock Island in the first place. An agent named Paxton was then ordered to conduct an interrogation with a letter of release from the Attorney General as reward if he accepted it. Mason was asked to cooperate in this mission. Because Paxton's character was too harsh, he was unable to persuade Mason. As an exchange, Stanley was suddenly asked to enter the interrogation room. The problem was, throughout his career at the FBI, Stanley had never dealt directly with a criminal. That's why as soon as he entered, he immediately agreed to all Mason's requests. It turned out that what they were offering Mason was nothing but bullshit. Even if he wants to cooperate, the FBI leadership doesn't want to let him go. Now while they were busy chatting, Mason secretly took the coin that Paxton had thrown at him. He flattened the coin using the edge of the chair, and when the opportunity arose, he again tried to escape from the location. With a super tight escort, Mason was finally taken to the hotel. The FBI even rented a special floor to secure him. Mason was allowed to shower, clean up, and so on. But Mason wasn't one to just surrender to the situation. Once again, he secretly began to look for ways to escape. Not long after, a long-haired hairdresser came to shave this most dangerous prisoner. But while being shaved, Mason secretly tied a rope that had been taken from the shower. He also had time to order hotel service some food, which eventually made all the officers busy eating. And as soon as the opportunity arose, Mason suddenly pushed the FBI leader. Stanley tried to point a gun at Mason, but at this time he wasn't in a position to negotiate. The slightest mistake, then the FBI leader will fall from a height. In the end, Mason again could escape from dozens of guards. Once Director Womack had been rescued by his members, Stanley immediately rushed to pursue Mason. Unfortunately, in the middle of the chase, Stanley was hit by a surprise attack, and Mason could escape the location by stealing a car that was parked in the hotel lobby. Several police cars were deployed to catch Mason. Stanley himself stole a Ferrari that in the hotel lobby. A chase ensued, and San Francisco was thrown into chaos by this old man. To escape from police pursuit, Mason then deliberately knocked down an electric pole by hitting it. From here, successive accidents ensued, and Stanley was the only agent left in this chase. Long story short, in the middle of the road, Mason acted again by accidentally crashing into a tram. As a result, the large vehicle went straight off the tracks and made unexpected events. Fortunately, Stanley could survive the accident, and he continued his pursuit by forcibly taking a motorcycle belonging to a civilian who was the location. However, Mason had already escaped quite far away. Therefore, Stanley asked other agents to find out if Mason had family in this city. This is where Stanley could find his target. It turns out that Mason ran away to meet his daughter, whom he had never met in his entire life. Mason is a former British Special Forces officer who was caught by the Americans. He has spent 30 years in prison, and to this day, the British government has never acknowledged his existence. Mason had nothing left to live for except his daughter. So he tried to convince his daughter that he wasn't a bad person. But just as he said that, suddenly the police had surrounded their place. Secretly, Stanley had been listening to Mason and his daughter's conversation. So he also lied to Mason's daughter and said that his father was now working for the FBI. At least that lie could improve Mason and his daughter's relationship. However, after all, what Mason did during the escape process had made Womack furious. Long story short, while at the military base, Mason was asked to explain the floor plan of the Rock Island. But since he had escaped from there more than 20 years ago, he began to forget the details of his escape. However, Mason said he might still remember if he went directly to the location. Hearing this, Womack immediately got angry because he was sure it was just a trick. Now scene returned to Dr. Stanley, who explains to the Special Forces members how to neutralize the chemical missile that Brigadier General Hummel stole. But because there was no more time for the explanation, they finally asked Stanley to be in charge of this mission. Stanley had never killed any criminals, but Paxton assured him that the Special Forces they sent were the best, so Stanley could focus only on neutralizing the chemical missile. Actually, there is something else that Stanley is worried about, where his girlfriend turns out to be flying to San Francisco, even though in the next dozen hours the chemical missile will hit this city. Long story short, before going to the Rock Island, the Special Forces leader named Anderson conducted a briefing, where he asked Stanley to light on a green flare if he had successfully neutralized the 15 chemical missiles, and from here the mission began. There were 3 helicopters approaching the island, but it was all just a diversion because from the beginning they would be dropped off in the middle of the ocean. The plan was for Mason to lead the way to the island through an underwater channel. From the start, Hummel had suspected that military officials would try to send special forces to the Rock Island. That's why he asked his members to immediately comb every location. On the other hand, once they entered the prison building, Stanley and his friends are trapped in a room. And the only way to open the access door there is through a combustion engine. Who would have thought that after 20 years, Mason would still remember the details of his escape? Even at the age 60, his body can still move with great agility. Long story short, they finally made it into the underground waterways. Hummel and his men had installed motion sensors at several points, so they had to be very careful. One of Anderson's men tried to neutralize the sensors above the aqueduct so they could enter the building through that route. Unfortunately, it was a trap from the beginning. Even if they could neutralize it, their location had been discovered. Even once Anderson and his men surfaced, they were surrounded from all directions. Hummel then asked Anderson to surrender. After all, there was no way they could escape. But Anderson still insisted on putting up a fight until there was an argument between the two of them. On the other hand, Stanley and Mason were still hiding in the waterways. Fortunately, they weren't in a hurry to go upstairs. Anderson and his men didn't stand a chance against Hummel. They were all mercilessly slaughtered. One of Anderson's men, who was still hiding with Stanley, wanted to help his friends, but he also was killed on the spot. After taking the radio and gun from the body in front of them, Mason invited Stanley to escape immediately. On the other hand, the people at headquarters realized that the two of them were still alive based on the tracking devices attached to their clothes. But instead of sending a follow-up team, Womack asked Stanley to continue his mission. Hummel deeply regretted what had just happened, so he sent a threatening message to headquarters that once again, the government was showing their indifference towards the soldiers who had fought for their nation. Now the question is, why is Womack so confident that this mission can succeed even though there are two people left? Soon we'll discover who Mason really is. It turns out that 30 years ago, Mason was arrested for stealing a microchip containing all the rottenness of American intelligence. Until now, they couldn't find the microchip, and that proves Mason's ingenuity and agility in dealing with every situation. Mason was only assigned to infiltrate the special forces to the Rock Island, so he hadn't been told what weapon Brigadier General Hummel would actually fire. Once Stanley leaked the information, he finally agreed to continue his mission. All of this is to ensure the safety of his daughter who lives in San Francisco. At the same time, the enemy finally realized that there were still two more intruders they had to get rid of. Not wanting to take any chances, Brigadier General Hummel ordered his men to immediately blow up the underground conduits. One by one, the bombs were dropped and they both almost died from the attack. As a result of the explosion, their communication channel to headquarters was cut off. Since the enemy thought they had both been eliminated, it was easier for Stanley and Mason to infiltrate the building. Not wanting to waste the opportunity, the two went straight to where the main storage of the chemical missiles was located. The fire action was inevitable, but Stanley warned them not to let their bullets miss the missiles. One of the enemies had wanted to carry out a suicide bombing. Fortunately, Mason could prevent it. Without wasting time, Stanley tried to neutralize the missiles one by one. The problem was, it took an incredible amount of precision and composure to do it, and if a single mistake happened, would have been fatal. After a while, the enemy finally realized where they were. The entire squad was assigned to follow them to the location. But Stanley didn't want to leave until he had defused all the missiles in front of them. The two of them then escaped into the sewers, but the unexpected happened again, because in the channel there was a former mining train. At first the two of them were happy to ride the train, because they could escape from enemy pursuit. But suddenly the train road was deadlocked. When he found out that all the chips in the missiles had disappeared, Brigadier General Hummel was furious. He also asked 3 of his members to follow him down, and it didn't take long for them to find Stanley's whereabouts. Fortunately, even in such a desperate position, Mason didn't run out of ideas. Stanley tried to escape using a cable car. 2 enemy troops almost killed him in a shootout, and again Mason came back to save him. Long story short, there were 8 hours left before the missile was launched. Because of the two of them, the number of missiles was drastically reduced. What was 15 pieces activated missiles, now only 3 left. Therefore, Brigadier General Hummel must immediately arrest Stanley to reclaim his chips. Instead of surrendering, Mason destroyed the chips. He didn't care if one of the hostages died, because it wasn't worth the number of casualties that would arise if the missile was successfully launched. Mason also saw this incident as an opportunity. He then asked Stanley to continue his search, while he would turn himself in to distract the enemy. Stanley finally found one of the chemical missiles. He quickly took the chip inside, but in the middle of the action, the enemy suddenly reappeared and then catch him. At the same time, Mason was asked various questions by Brigadier General Hummel. During his time on duty, he had never seen an ordinary old man assigned to a special level mission. Mason himself tries to teach Hummel his madness. It could say that they were both betrayed by their country. But that doesn't mean innocent citizens have to been victims because of that. In the end, they were both thrown into prison. Stanley didn't stop babbling about their condition, while Mason quietly went straight back into action. It was a good thing that Brigadier General Hummel didn't know who Mason was. Had he known, he might have placed some guards to prevent him from escaping. Armed with a spray and a bed iron, Mason once again could escape from prison. The people at headquarters thought Stanley and Mason were dead, as their GPS was no longer working. Therefore, they began to develop a backup plan where within the next 1 hour they would send several fighter jets to destroy the Rock Island. Long story short, the time that Brigadier General Hummel gave the government was running out. But to date, they have yet to fulfill their demands. Instead, the government called to ask for more time. This made all of Hummel's subordinates start to get hot and burn, then asked the Brigadier General to make a decision immediately. Because there was no other choice, Brigadier General Hummel finally agreed to launch one of the missiles to San Francisco. The people at headquarters were already terrified, because the missile would hit the soccer stadium, which if it happened would killing tens of thousands of people. But at the last moment, Hummel secretly used his computer to change the coordinates of the missile. The missile finally hit the ocean. Some members of Brigadier General Hummel realized that it was their own leader's doing. One of Hummel's subordinates named Major Tom Baxter asked his actions just now. It turned out that from the beginning, Brigadier General Hummel didn't want to kill any civilians. All his actions were just a bluff to get the government to uphold justice. Then back to Stanley and Mason, who secretly could infiltrate the main building. When the missile was fired, Stanley panicked. But from the beginning, Mason had guessed that Hummel would not dare to kill civilians. The proof was that until now, the two of them hadn't been executed. On the other hand, there was still one more missile they had to hack for this mission to succeed. Seeing Hummel's attack made the President of the United States finally agree to destroy the Rock Island. Even though there were 81 hostages held there, the government continued with its plan to avoid further attacks. Several members of Hummel came to the meeting and asked the action. However, Brigadier General Hummel tried to explain that all their efforts were over and it was time to escape and run away. Unfortunately, the three members were desperate for the ransom money. After all, they had sacrificed their military careers for this stunt, so there was a dispute between them. At the same time, Mason and Stanley overheard the conversation. Mason and Stanley immediately saved Brigadier General Hummel in order to find out where the last location of the chemical missile was. Without wasting time, Stanley went straight there. Unfortunately, due to this incident, Brigadier General Hummel's life was lost as well as his loyal member, Major Baxter. Stanley finally could find the last missile, but in the middle of the action, the enemy reappeared. Fortunately, the enemy didn't dare to open fire when they saw Stanley holding dozens of chemical balls in his hands. In the midst of confusion, Stanley suddenly had an idea to defeat his enemy. Stanley then climbed to the top floor so he could immediately neutralize the missile. Then in the middle of the action, one of the chemical balls fell to the ground. Fortunately, it didn't explode. The problem arose again when one of the enemies saw him from afar and shot him relentlessly. Fortunately, Mason soon came to help him, and with that, all the missiles had been successfully secured by Stanley. Now the problem is, Stanley must immediately inform the people at headquarters about the success of their mission by lighting up a green flare. Because if not, in the next few minutes, the Rock Island will be flattened to the ground. On the other hand, Stanley doesn't stop being chased by one of the enemies. Mason tries to save him again, but the obstacles seem endless. In the end, Stanley had to face the enemy in front of him with his own hands. But because he has no weapons, Stanley has no choice to use a chemical ball from a former missile as his weapon. Secretly, he also has an antidote from the poison. However, the drug will not work if the user has been exposed for more than 5 seconds. Once he defeated his enemy, Stanley immediately turned on the flares because the fighter jets were almost at the island. The Marines, who were monitoring the island from afar, immediately informed the people at headquarters. Paxton immediately told the fighter pilots to cancel their action. However, in the end, one of the planes had already dropped its bomb. Fortunately, the bomb only hit the back side of the island. Stanley himself could survive even though he was affected by the explosion. Long story short, the people at headquarters tried to contact the two of them again. They asked if Mason was still alive, but Stanley chose to lie. Before splitting ways, Mason gave a small note containing information on where the secret microchip was stored, a microchip targeted by the government for the last 30 years. Moments later, FBI officials came to pick him up. Once again, they asked where Mason was, but Stanley said his body destroyed to be ash by chemical gas. Then, after that, the movie ended.